this is Kelly Sadler, and this is this week's Politically Unstable. I have with me Tim Murtaugh, who is the CEO and founder of Line Drive Public Relations. He also has the Line Drive podcast that you can listen into, and he's also a Washington Times columnist and was the former communications director for the Trump campaign in 2020. Tim, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Kelly. Thanks for having me. And boy, that was a mouthful. The proudest thing on there is that I'm a Washington Times columnist.
Yes, absolutely. So let's discuss what happened on Monday night in Iowa. Kind of what are your biggest takeaways? Kind of what do you assess of the night and the campaign moving forward?
Well, I think the biggest, most obvious takeaway is that is there anyone left anywhere who does not believe that this is Donald Trump's nomination to lose? I mean, he went into the Iowa caucuses ahead in the polls, somewhere north of 50%. And that's exactly the number he came in with. 51% is the share of the vote he took. And we were just talking about this before we started the tape. And I think that the people who think that somehow when Ron DeSantis withdraws from the race, which I think is, of course, inevitable, and I don't think it'll be very long before he does that somehow that Nikki Haley will get a boost. I think that it's plain to see that the lion's share of DeSantis votes will probably go to Trump. And that this is Trump's party. A super majority of Republican voters want Trump to be president again, or at the very least, think he deserves another shot at the title. And I think for anyone entering this race to challenge former President Donald Trump, that was always going to be insurmountable. This was his nomination to lose. If he wanted it, it was always going to be his.
So I've got a question. So there was a lot of hubbub on social media last night about how quickly the AP called the race, that there was basically people in Iowa that were still, caucusing that hadn't cast their votes yet. And that was incredibly unfair. And of course, the DeSantis campaign made hay of this, saying it was unfair to their candidate. And the process was skewed because of that. Kind of what's your take on the AP calling the race so quickly?
Yeah. So look, I think two things can be true. I think one, that the AP should not have called Iowa for President Trump as early as they did. People were still in their caucus meetings. There were caucus speeches, according to anecdotal reports, speeches still going on. Some caucus locations, they had not even begun to vote yet. People are getting notifications on their phone. It spreads like wildfire on social media, of course. So I believe that the Associated Press had no business calling it while things were still underway. That is against their own policy and against like everyone's policy. Any media outlet has a policy these days against that kind of thing. So that said, AP should not have done that. I don't think, this can also be true, I don't think it had any impact. Yeah. If you were already at the caucus location, why would you just storm out? I think if you were not there yet, maybe you can make an argument. But if you were already present and physically there, then I think there's no way you wouldn't continue with whatever the proceedings were in front of you. So I think that it was a bad call, but I don't think it had any impact. Donald Trump went into the night as the gigantic favorite, and the numbers came out almost exactly what the polling was.
Exactly. Now, so let's talk about Ron DeSantis for a second. So he narrowly got second place, right? He eked it out. He got second place, but he was all in Iowa. That it was his entire campaign. So where do you think he goes now? Do you think he should drop out before New Hampshire? And then endorse Donald Trump? I mean, I personally think that would be the smartest thing to do professionally for Ron DeSantis to kind of save his reputation as being Florida's governor and an all-star within the GOP, a future all-star. I think the longer he stays in the race, the more kind of that erodes at his political, acumen.
Yeah, look, the clock is ticking on him for sure, and things are not going to get better for him in New Hampshire. I mean, I don't know if they've actually removed Chris Christie's name from the ballot or not since he withdrew, but, DeSantis stands a pretty good chance of finishing fourth in New Hampshire. And let's take a look at what happened to him in Iowa. There is no state anywhere in this country where the conditions are going to be better for Ron DeSantis than they were in Iowa. He had the endorsement of the governor, Kim Reynolds, and with her political operation and the ground game and her network that goes along with that. He had the endorsement of a guy named Bob Vander Plaats, who is a very famous conservative leader in Iowa, enormous grassroots network. And so he had the support of both of those political machines. He and the super PAC that supports him spent tens of millions of dollars in Iowa on television ads. He had this vaunted ground game where his team knocked on hundreds of thousands of doors in Iowa. Every potential Republican voter got at least one door knock from the DeSantis team. It's never going to get better than it was for him in Iowa. And all the while, he went from 30% at the first poll months back to 21%. So he lost ground in a state where he could arguably have been the strongest. So the future is not bright, nor is it long for the DeSantis campaign, I would say.
Okay, so let's talk about Nikki Haley. She came in third. You could say she maybe outperformed expectations. There's been a surge in her campaign, whatever. Chris Sununu, the governor of New Hampshire, was on Fox News earlier today saying that she's got a real shot in New Hampshire, that this is not over. Of course, he's endorsed her, but we've seen how endorsements really don't matter that much, right? Because as you just said, Ron DeSantis had Kim Reynolds' endorsement, and that didn't give him any sort of boost in the state of Iowa. So when it comes to New Hampshire, how do you think this plays out? And do you think that Nikki Haley has a chance, perhaps, of winning the state?
It's anybody who makes bold predictions about the future of politics, especially in this kind of environment, I think is a little bit foolish to do so. But again, New Hampshire, it's Donald Trump's race. I mean, it's his to win. Either his lead is single digits or it's over 20. Depending on what poll you look at. I don't think what happened in Iowa gives Nikki Haley any momentum. I mean, she went out immediately after the results were known, and she said, okay, this is now a two-person race, just after she had finished third. So it makes no sense. Any momentum that she thought she was going to get, it has been completely blunted, and she doesn't come into New Hampshire, riding a wave or excitement or anything. She had allowed expectations that she could potentially finish second in Iowa take hold. And so finishing third is a real letdown for her. And it's a state where she's not in the lead again in New Hampshire. Yeah, she's got the support of the governor, but I don't really know what that matters. I think it is without question, once again, it's Donald Trump that has the momentum. If she comes close to him in New Hampshire, maybe that helps her a little bit. But if you look ahead more than a month down in South Carolina, her home state, President Trump has been dominating all of the polls in South Carolina from the very beginning of this. And then you move on to Nevada. Is anybody going to beat Trump in Nevada? And then Super Tuesday comes. And look, it's Donald Trump's nomination. Unless something catastrophic happens to himself personally, he is going to be the Republican nominee for president once again.
So Vivek Ramaswamy, he dropped out. He didn't have the showing that he wanted in Iowa. And he is turning around and he's going on the campaign trail, endorsing Donald Trump and basically, campaigning on his behalf. Do you think that's a good move? I mean, what do you think of Vivek? What do you think of his future? What do you think of his campaign up until Iowa?
He ran a pretty inventive campaign. He's obviously a very good showman. He's quick on his feet. He's really good with interactions. He's good taking the hostile questions and turning it around on the interviewer. There's not a whole lot. Now he has formally endorsed Donald Trump after not doing 7% in the Iowa caucuses. Honestly, from where I sit, there's not a whole lot that has changed in the Ramaswamy campaign. I mean, the only thing that lets you know that he was a candidate in the race is that he hadn't yet fully endorsed Donald Trump. I mean, every step along the way, he was 100% supportive of Donald Trump. He went out in the street. He was demanding people sign a petition to stop the prosecutions and all that stuff. I mean, he was as pro-Trump as you can possibly be while still remaining a candidate in this same race that Trump is running in. I think it was clear all along that when Ramaswamy dropped out, nearly 100% of his support would go back to Trump because, he's very much aligned. And his future, I think he did do himself some favors in Republican circles here. Near the end, President Trump kind of smacked him down a little bit. But I think there is the possibility if President Trump becomes president again, that maybe there's a spot in the cabinet for Vivek Ramaswamy. I don't know, but I think he ran a good race for what was possible. He was never going to be the nominee. But, I think he was entertaining, but he never really had a shot to win.
Well, he was also very personable. He was great in, as you said, hostile interviews. I think that he's a good voice for the party moving forward. He's got a great story and he's really pursues an innovative, agenda. He was the first to kind of call out ESG and the dangers of that, the dangers of DEI. And so I think, I've always liked his candidacy. I always liked his campaign. I always thought it was very hopeful and optimistic and had a great, very pro-America theme, which I admired. And I thought he was a good voice in the race.
He's obviously a very smart man and extremely successful in business. He's an entrepreneur and, Donald Trump likes those kinds of qualities. So, there absolutely could be a role for him in the future.
So this week, David Bossie is coming out with a column in the Washington Times, basically calling on all of the other GOP candidates in the race to drop out and to endorse Donald Trump, that this really is the only path forward, that we've got to focus and we've got to pivot to the general election as quickly as possible and juxtapose, the America First agenda against what the Biden administration has done in their record. Do you support what Bossie's saying here, or do you think that, all the candidates should stick it out at least until South Carolina?
Each one of these candidates is going to make his or her own mind up, and every time these people look in the mirror, they all see a future president in the mirror in the morning, right? That's the way they all view themselves. But I think Bossie is right. There is no path forward for anyone not named Trump in this race. And the more that it prolongs this, the more that it exhausts donors, it spends money that Joe Biden is not spending. These are Republican dollars that are being spent that are, you're going to have to go back and raise that money a second time and sometimes hit up the same people again. And that's not always easy. I think it's better for the party. It's better for the entire structure. And it's better for the general election if people would get out and get behind Donald Trump. He is the inevitable nominee. I don't know who can't see that. And at a certain point, all of these campaigns will turn into vanity exercises. And I think we're past that point for Ron DeSantis now. Now it's a vanity exercise. I mean, I don't think there's anyone who believes, outside of the tight-knit DeSantis crew at the core of his campaign, that he could possibly have a chance of winning this. Getting out really is the only sensible thing to do. Otherwise, it's a complete waste of time and resources.
I agree. I absolutely 100% agree with you. And as far as Nikki Haley goes, I think it'd be really smart for President Trump to basically say, hey, I like Nikki. I'd like to appoint her as Secretary of State when I, win the nomination and win the presidency. And I'd like to have her join the administration in that capacity. I think that might move some of her voters over into the Trump camp for the general election. But that's just my 2 cents here. In terms of if people have been speculating, Nikki Haley would be a good vice president for Donald Trump. In terms of the vice presidential pick, have you been hearing anything? Where do you think Donald Trump might land?
Well, I have no idea where he's going to land. I mean, you know him too. And there's only one person who truly knows what direction that's going to be. And that's going to be Donald Trump at the end. And I'm not convinced. I'm not sure you could convince me that he knows who it's going to be right now. I think he probably has a list of names in mind. There are some folks that I have liked. I like Elise Stefanik. I like Tim Scott. I think that Elise has been a great leader in the House. I think Tim Scott ran a really good race and did himself a lot of favors while he was running. Yeah. And he's one of the few, I think, who entered this race and is coming out of it not as the winner, but having done himself some political good while doing it. So, I mean, I don't pretend to know who he's going to select, but I think we'll find out when Donald Trump is ready for all of us to find out. Do you think it should be a woman? I mean, there's been a lot of speculation that he needs to pick a woman to bring in the kind of the suburban mother vote in the general. Do you think that's important or not? I think that's a consideration. Look, I mean, the rule about picking a vice presidential candidate and your running mate is to bring to the ticket things that you don't possess or things that you can't bring. I mean, look at when he selected Mike Pence. That was, opening the door to the evangelical community, which Trump, in theory in 2016 did not have. And Mike Pence, from the Midwest, a former governor, had elective office experience as a major figure in the evangelical community. That pick made a lot of sense. I think those are all the kinds of things that you have to look at. What are your strengths and where can you use, some bucking up and some support? Gender is one of those questions. I don't know that Donald Trump would necessarily pay attention to that kind of checking of a box. And, that's something that we more associate with the left doing, but it's a political consideration that you have to make. So I'm sure that's being thought of.
Okay. And one final question. In 2020, you were on the official campaign side. I was on the super PAC side. We both saw poll after poll after poll. Let's say we were in those capacities this time around. We're both not, but if we were, how would you feel about the state of the race and Donald Trump's likelihood to win the general election in November 2024?
I think it's really good. I mean, if you look back at the polling of 2020 and even in 2016, there were never polls. I know in 2020, there was not one single poll that showed Donald Trump ahead of Joe Biden nationally, not one. And in 2024, there's a ton that show him ahead of Joe Biden, so much so that you got the Democrats on the other side freaking out. It's basically unprecedented for them, for there's a sizable amount of the Democratic Party who wants to toss the incumbent president of the United States off the ticket because they don't think he's electable a second time around. His record is abysmal. The guy is clearly out of his mind. He doesn't know what's going on. There was an episode up in Pennsylvania last week where you just thought, well, honest to God, who is in charge? The lights are on, but nobody's home, when watching this guy in action. And so I think that if it's Trump against Biden, I think it still will be a close election. But I think absolutely if it were today, Donald Trump would be reelected again. Now, there's an eternity. There's 10 months left until election day. So God knows what's going to happen. But if it were today, I think Donald Trump does win.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I saw this, not the same polls, other polls. And you're right. Absolutely. Donald Trump was always trailing at that time. But the fact that he's actually gaining ground in the battleground states, because that's what it's really going to come down to. It's that national polls really don't matter, but it is like 5 or 6 battleground states that are really going to determine this election. And so far, he's doing strong and doing well. So it just depends on what happens to him legally. A lot of this campaign is going to be fought in the courtroom, unfortunately, for Donald Trump. But just comparing the records, comparing and contrasting, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? I think overwhelmingly the majority of Americans say they are not. So I think the records and the policies will speak for themselves in November. But who knows? Well, who knows what might happen by then? There could be another COVID crisis. Who knows? Hopefully not. But you never know. You never know.
We never saw that one coming.
Yeah, exactly.
He would be president right now if it weren't for COVID. I firmly believe that.
I do too. Yeah. Well, Tim, thank you so much for joining me today. And we should probably do this, later on in the campaign, maybe after New Hampshire or South Carolina. It was great catching up with you.
Yep. Great to see you, Kelly. Thank you.
All right. And thanks everyone for tuning in. This is today's Politically Unstable.